Welcome to this edition of Head to Head. I'm your host, Cam McKinney, and this is episode number 267 of the podcast. And on this episode, I'm talking about Spurs head coach Greg Popovich signing a long-term extension with the team. Greg Popovich is without a doubt one of the best basketball coaches of all time. The Hall of Fame coach has 1,364 wins, the most all time. He's a 5-time NBA champion, which is tied for third most all time. He's a 3-time coach of the year and has been head coach of the All-Star game 4 times in his illustrious career. When I think of the great modern basketball coaches, I think about Phil Jackson, Pat Riley, and Greg Popovich. They were all so good for so very long. On Saturday, it was announced by the team that Popovich had re-signed with the Spurs on a 5-year contract worth $80 million, making him the highest paid coach in the league, and it's a bit of an odd timing. The team is coming off of a season where they went 22-60, and it's been a rough stretch for the Spurs lately. In the last 4 years, the team has a record of 121 wins and 186 losses, and you can pinpoint the exact moment where things began to fall apart for the Spurs, when star Kawhi Leonard was dealing with injuries and was going against the team wishes. And of course, we all know how that ended up. Kawhi Leonard was traded to the Toronto Raptors and led the franchise to their sole NBA title. And the Spurs were left without the one thing that every team in the NBA needs, a superstar player. At one point, they had a lot of them in Tim Duncan, Tony Parker, David Robinson, and Manu Ginobili. I mean, all 4 of those guys bought in. Nobody saw Kawhi not wanting to play for Popovich coming, and the team has never recovered. It's the most out-of-character thing that has ever happened to the San Antonio Spurs. And while it was happening, I think we all thought that the Spurs at some point would recover. They got DeMar DeRozan in that trade. It didn't really work out with him. He's a star player, but he's not a superstar player. Then they lost DeRozan, and they haven't been able to find a superstar player since. That is until possibly now, because one of the biggest reasons the Spurs want Popovich to stay is that so he can coach number 1 overall pick Victor Wembanyama. Just look at what Popovich did with the last Spur drafted first overall Tim Duncan. Logically, that makes sense. You want your young star to get good coaching, although it's worth mentioning that it's a very different NBA now than the one Popovich dominated with Duncan. Victor Wembanyama is going to have to take some outside shots. Big men are not dominating the league like they have in the past. The other reason the Spurs want Popovich around is because he is the big name. When you think of the Spurs, you think of Greg Popovich. He's become infamous for his halftime interviews where he comes off as disinterested, to say the least. In recent years, he's also become known for his political stances. He's become a respected voice. This situation reminds me of what's going on with the New England Patriots and Bill Belichick in football. Belichick, like Popovich, is no longer winning at the same rate, yet there has rarely ever been serious talk about their job security. It makes you wonder what would have to happen for these 2 all-time coaches to lose their jobs. Both recently have been through rough patches lately, and I wouldn't bet on either of them winning a championship anytime soon. It feels like at this moment, both Popovich and Belichick will end their careers with the Spurs and Patriots respectively, that they will retire and not be shown the door. The San Antonio Spurs are giving a 74-year-old Greg Popovich a 5-year deal, and the other thing he and Belichick have in common are both are presidents of their respective teams. They have complete control of their rosters. They are not just figureheads, and that's the thing I question the most. Giving Popovich that much power doesn't seem wise. It worked in the past. The Spurs were a dynasty, no doubt about it, but the last few years are proof that things may need to change. Coach and team president should be 2 different jobs with 2 different people filling those positions. Yes, if you were naming the coach who has had the best career in the NBA right now, that would be Greg Popovich. But is he the best head coach right now. No, I think that honor goes to Eric Spoelstra. I would also put Mike Malone ahead of him. There are better coaches in the NBA right now than Greg Popovich. Steve Kerr of the Golden State Warriors is ahead of Popovich in my mind right now. I think you could name 5 better NBA head coaches than Greg Popovich. This is what I would say about Greg Popovich. I would want Greg Popovich to be my coach if I had a ready-made championship team. But the Spurs are in rebuild mode. It does not make a whole lot of sense for Greg Popovich to be the head coach of the San Antonio Spurs. It makes no sense to act like the last 4 years haven't happened and that the rebuild is starting now. You can't just start that clock whenever you want to. The Spurs should have been rebuilding. Them luckying out and getting that number 1 pick has nothing to do with Greg Popovich. Like, I get it. You want the superstar player. I think you want Greg Popovich for his name more than you do about his qualifications as a coach, because right now the last 4 years has been dreadful. Yes, you can say all the things you want. They used to say it all the time. The Spurs will play hard. They're always a smart basketball team. 22-60 does not look like a smart basketball team on paper. If this was a team that was averaging 35 wins over the last 4 years, then yes, I could understand where you're coming from, but they're coming off of a season where they went 22-60, and if the plan was to tank, then I don't understand what that says about Greg Popovich. Like, why do the Spurs need Greg Popovich? And I'm not even arguing that the Spurs should move on from Greg Popovich. I'm here to question what his actual worth to the San Antonio Spurs is. Is he worth being the highest paid coach in basketball? That just doesn't add up to me. I know he's getting it because he has the job title of head coach and president. I'm saying he doesn't deserve both of those job titles. Greg Popovich should probably be able to coach the San Antonio Spurs for as long as he wants. But in that time period, he shouldn't be the highest paid coach in the league because he's not bringing what he usually does to the table. And I'm not insane. I know Greg Popovich isn't going to win 5 more NBA championships, but if he could consistently lead the Spurs to be a 50-win NBA team that makes the playoffs every year, I would be fine with that. Nobody is saying that Greg Popovich has to be as good as he was in the past to maintain his status as one of the best coaches in the league, but he should be able to maintain the Spurs being relevant. How many discussions have you had about the San Antonio Spurs in the last 4 years? They have become completely irrelevant, and the only reason we are talking about them now is because they got the number 1 overall draft pick. It has nothing to do with Greg Popovich. You can only live in the past success for so long because sports are a what have you done for me lately? And again, I'm not saying that Greg Popovich should have won an NBA championship in the last 4 years. I just don't think the Spurs have been very respectable the last few seasons. They have not been a team I have paid attention to whatsoever. If he really were somebody worthy of being the highest coach in the league, then the Spurs would have made the play-in tournament the last 2 seasons, which they have not. Now, this is where things get interesting because the NBA is a league where one all-time player can change everything. Victor Wembanyama has a lot of pressure on him to be that guy for the Spurs. The Spurs were a model of consistency, but everything has changed. They've missed the playoffs the last 4 years and haven't won a playoff round since 2017. The last title they won was in 2014. I believe Popovich is a great coach, that the Spurs should keep him, but him being the highest coach doesn't make a lot of sense. So let's say Victor Wembanyama is great next season and the Spurs are back on the map. What does that say about Greg Popovich that he needs these stars to be as good as he is? I'm not saying that that should take away from his overall legacy. I'm just saying that we used to have this belief that if you had Greg Popovich as your coach, your team would at the very least not be bad. Well, the Spurs have been bad for a few years now. And say what you will about Kawhi Leonard, he misses too many games. Maybe you don't want him to be the superstar player on your team, but I blame Popovich for what happened between Kawhi Leonard and the San Antonio Spurs. The league, like it or not, is all about the stars, and Greg Popovich did not get along with the most important player on the San Antonio Spurs, and I don't think he's been rightfully blamed for what happened in that situation, because Kawhi Leonard immediately went to another team and won another NBA Finals MVP award. Now, you could say it hasn't worked for Kawhi Leonard and the LA Clippers. Well, at least the Clippers have remained relevant. They've made the playoffs. Now, Kawhi Leonard is missing way too many games, but still, I think in the past, Greg Popovich should have done everything in his power to keep Kawhi Leonard on the San Antonio Spurs. You didn't make that guy happy, and that was your one job. That is the job of the modern NBA coach, is to make your superstar happy. It's not about being a dictator coach anymore. It's not about being the face of the Spurs. The most important thing the San Antonio Spurs need is a superstar player, not a Hall of Fame coach. And that's something that's been debated in sports since the very beginning. What's more important, the great coach or the great players? Is it Joe Montana or is it Bill Walsh? Is it Tom Brady or is it Bill Belichick? Is it Tim Duncan or is it Greg Popovich? And I think what we're finding out when it comes to Greg Popovich and when it comes to Bill Belichick, that having great players is more important than having a great coach, because those great players don't go through those down years. But when these coaches lose those superstar players, we see them hit rock bottom. Greg Popovich has hit rock bottom, yet he stays the highest paid coach in the league. I just kind of have a problem with that. And I'm someone who really likes it when a team sticks with the head coach through the rough times. I loved it when the Dallas Mavericks kept Rick Carlisle, because I believed Rick Carlisle was one of the better coaches in the NBA. I liked it when the Miami Heat stuck by Eric Spoelstra. They're now being rewarded for that. I like that the Pittsburgh Steelers are keeping Mike Tomlin. I like a team that is loyal to their coach, but that doesn't mean I need that coach to be regarded like he's the best coach in the league. That's when we're talking about these crazy numbers. A 5-year, $80 million deal for Greg Popovich. Is that really the way the San Antonio Spurs should be spending their money? I get it. It doesn't take into the salary cap or whatever. It just doesn't add up to me why that guy is now one of the highest paid members of the San Antonio Spurs and the highest coach in the NBA. I don't think he deserves that honor at this time period. From 2000 to 2016, yes, he absolutely deserved to be the highest paid coach in the league and regarded as one of the greatest coaches of all time. And he was that. He is that. He will forever be one of the greatest coaches of all time. But I am interested and I question, when does that ship sail? When does that not become relevant anymore? When does that start to mean nothing for the San Antonio Spurs? There has been no excitement regarding that team, and now there is excitement because of a player they drafted, not because Greg Popovich will remain their head coach. And I think San Antonio Spurs fans would be honest. It doesn't matter that Greg Popovich is staying. What's more important is they have a potential superstar player. I will give this to Greg Popovich. Modern basketball has not been favorable to the market of San Antonio because the league now is all about player movement. They had a core, the Spurs, in Duncan, Parker, and Ginobili. They stayed together. They drafted those free Hall of Famers, and that's just not how great teams are built anymore. Now great teams are about recruiting superstars to join your team, and the Spurs are just not a team that is going to attract all-star free agents. So the Spurs are going to have to build this team by the draft and by smart trades. On paper, you would think Greg Popovich is a coach that superstars would want to be coached by. He's been the coach of Team USA, but I think him coaching in San Antonio is hurting that fact. He cannot get superstars to go to San Antonio. They would rather go to those bigger markets like LA or Miami, or even Boston attracts more superstars than the Spurs. But again, I have to bring up what happened with Kawhi Leonard and the Spurs. You have to imagine that that has affected the relationship between Popovich and other star players around the league. Other guys saw that situation play out, and I have to imagine that some of them went, I don't want to play for that that guy. In the history of the franchise, they've only really gotten one superstar player to join their team, and that was LaMarcus Aldridge, and that really didn't end up working out. They thought that Kawhi Leonard, LaMarcus Aldridge would become the new duo to replace Tony Parker and Tim Duncan, and that didn't end up playing out because of the Kawhi Leonard situation. I think that's something that's never been fully resolved. I just have overall complicated feelings about this contract being given to Popovich. I mean, you could argue that it is earned. He's a 5-time NBA champion. I mean, this is the going rate for somebody like that. But you could also say it's undeserved by what's happened over the last 4 years. Should Popovich be paid for what he's done, or should he be paid for what he's going to do? I would go for the latter, but clearly the Spurs are thinking differently here. What this really feels like is the Spurs giving him a lifetime job. Like, this is tenure. This is them saying we are never going to fire Greg Popovich. And maybe that is earned, because when you think of the 5 most important people in San Antonio Spurs franchise history, Greg Popovich has to be at the top of that list, with Tim Duncan, with Manu Ginobili, with Tony Parker. I just think the last 4 years has proven that he needs those superstar players as much as they need him. Since I've watched basketball, I just always have these expectations that the Spurs are going to overachieve no matter what their roster would look like, that Greg Popovich would get the best out of what he has, and he hasn't done that recently. Again, last season the Spurs went 22-60. If Greg Popovich is your coach, at minimum you should be winning 35 plus games. Now, I understand what all of you are going to say. He was tanking. Well, if you're tanking, why do I need Greg Popovich to be the highest coach in the league? Is he really going to turn Victor Wembanyama into a superstar player? Or could any coach do that? If you believe that much in Victor Wembanyama, then you probably don't need Greg Popovich to be his coach. And I don't think Popovich should lose his job. I just don't think he should be the highest coach in the NBA. That honor should be given to Eric Spoelstra. Monty Williams is now making less than Greg Popovich. I would rather my team right now being coached by Monty Williams than Greg Popovich. 7 years ago, Greg Popovich staying with the Spurs would have been bigger news and a no doubt home run for the organization. Now I'm just not sure how to feel about it. He's going to be judged by how he develops Wembanyama. If he's a star by the end, Popovich would be leaving the organization in a great place. But if it doesn't go well, we'll look back at this contract extension second guessing it. I'll also add this to it. I don't know if the Spurs are the best place for Greg Popovich right now. I do believe at this point in his career, he should be the coach of a team that is stacked with all-stars. He should be the coach of a team like the Phoenix Suns with Kevin Durant. I would love for him at some point to be the coach of the Lakers with LeBron James. Now he's just going to remain a member of the San Antonio Spurs, who at best are going to win, 40 games next season because of Victor Wembanyama? I mean, I'm not expecting the Spurs to make the playoffs. At the very best, they could be making the play-in tournament because they now have a guy who we believe has superstar potential. The last thing I'll say is that when you have Greg Popovich coaching your team, we're all going to just fixate on the past. We're going to talk about those 5 NBA championships. We're going to think about Tim Duncan, Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili. I feel what's best for the organization, the Spurs, is to think about the future, and that's Victor Wembanyama. And you don't want to put that much pressure on him, because when Greg Popovich isn't winning basketball games at the same rate he used to, that's the thing we're going to fixate on. That's the thing I'm fixating on, because when I watched basketball for the first decade, all this man did was win. In the last 4 years, he hasn't been doing a lot of it, and if he doesn't start too soon, it doesn't make a lot of sense to give him the most money of any basketball coach in the NBA. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the Spurs are about to go on another great run, but that doesn't take away what's happened the last 4 seasons when the Spurs were irrelevant. And because of those 4 seasons, this extension to me makes absolutely no sense. I believe Greg Popovich is a top 5 NBA head coach of all time. I believe what he did in the past was extraordinary. I don't think it adds anything to what he's about to do. The Spurs clearly just don't want to move on from the past, and I understand that. Why would you? That was a great run. When you think of the San Antonio Spurs, those are the teams you think of, and when you think of their head coach, you think of Greg Popovich. They want to remain a stable organization. The problem is, they're not the consistent franchise they used to be. Thanks for listening to this edition of Head to Head. I'm Cam McKinney, and there'll be a new episode of the podcast every Monday on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, so please rate, review, and subscribe.